Hello all, welcome back to Psych Motivation. This is our second chapter on emotion, so let's talk about aspects of emotion this time around. I hope you all are doing well. I lost my clicker. I hope you all are doing well and you're staying safe and you're staying healthy. Challenging times for us, huh? One of the big questions might now be when we see Governor DeWine and we see the folks on his team who are taking a real proactive approach to our pandemic. I think their approach will be something to study in the future for its effectiveness. I think they're using reason and science-based approach to attempting to, we might be tired of the cliche now, but to flatten the curve, that is to spread out the incidence of the coronavirus. A lot to respect in the level of their performance and the level of their thought. Think about it, one of the key issues is to motivate people to adhere to policy guidelines that will help flatten the curve. So when we think in terms of motivation globally, right, to what extent can we cause people to approach successful behaviors to flatten the curve, and to what extent can we help people be motivated to avoid certain ideas? Not perfectly described in our lecture, but there'll be some points that I can probably bring up along the way that kind of make it real for this point in time. But for the most part, we're going to remain, largely conceptual and move through it. Oh, look there. This picture here, I love this. We had a cat come to us, Boots, and cold weather time. She looked kind of pregnant, and I brought her in so she could have her babies, because we learned about cats that if you bring a feral cat in, right, and Boots turned out not to be feral but just stray. What's the difference, you ask? Feral, you can't pick up. Stray, you can pick up. I mean, that's kind of the most notable criteria there. So I brought Boots in, put her in her second, what was our office at the time on the second floor, and lo and behold, she wasn't very pregnant when I brought her in, because she waited a long time before she had her babies, and she blessed us with 6 babies who were all adopted by the same person out on a farm. So we call this picture Boots Babies. Boots was a great mom, and Boots, in fact, Boots is sitting over there on the bed right now, just listening to this. I don't think she's listening, actually. I think she's sleeping. Not that you guys ever do that, but right. So let's talk about aspects of emotion and get started. 3 central aspects of emotion: biological, cognitive, sociocultural. So if we want to understand emotion, these are the components that we can look at to better understand how emotion works, where it comes from, how it behaves. So we're going to start with some biological aspects here. What contributes to our emotional experience? Well, the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is, in this context, responsible for activation and deactivation, so to speak. That is jacking us up or calming us down, if you want to use that kind of terminology. It involves the endocrine system, right? So all the organs that secrete hormones through the body. The neural brain circuits. Some people really talk about the rate of neural firing as a component of this, and then facial feedback as an aspect. And notice when I say some people, when we study emotion, to me, both emotion and almost as much motivation are wide open constructs in psychology. So what we think we know will constantly be under review and being consistently updated. This is a wide open field. It's not a field of answers, it's a field of better and better questions. And I think it will continue to be that for a good long time. We develop a lot of evidence, which leads us to new questions, and based on those questions, then we develop new evidence. And oftentimes we're set back on our heels to rethink where we had been at some point in the past. So the cognitive, social, and cultural aspects, appraisal, so we'll define that word, knowledge, attributions, socialization history, right, and cultural identities. So let's move on here. So the neural activation, neural firing, is the pattern of electrocortical activity. at any time. And this is the firing rate. To what extent are the neurons firing off? And this is measurable through EEG, among other techniques, but EEG is one of the most common. And it gets really complicated. This is where psychology daunts many of us, in that there's so many specialized fields in psychology. It becomes difficult to, it becomes impossible to be an expert in many simultaneous fields within psychology. But what do we see in the rate of firing? Keeping it simple, right? We see the bottom axis of the chart is time, over time, so time in seconds, and the rate of neural firing is the y-axis. And what do we see? That activity increasing, right, and activity decreasing over time. So what emotions? Surprise is an activating emotion, that is, neural firing increases, and that kind of makes a very basic sense, does it not? Fear, of course, a slightly lower slope than surprise, a less steep slope, and interest. So if we look surprise, fear, and interest, we can kind of array them in terms of their neural activity, that is, the neural rate of firing, with surprise firing most rapidly over the shortest amount of time, and of those three being compared, interest least firing over a longer period of time. Right? So interest builds more slowly. Surprise comes on us very quickly. Fear posited to be somewhere in between. Right? We see with anger that the activity is suggested to remain constant, as is distress. And then we see with joy, activity and neural firing actually decreases. These are fascinating ideas. We'll return to kind of put them in your back pocket, if you will. So the neuroscience of emotion, what do we know? One of the brain's emotion systems operates mainly at the unconscious level. It relies on deep limbic structures. And my own dissertation research, I was researching non-conscious emotions, in part trying to answer the question, do non-conscious emotions even exist? And this then requires being able to come into the laboratory, create a non-conscious emotion, but then being able to measure and demonstrate that it was in fact non-conscious rather than conscious. But these deep limbic structures, these are built, you know, we think the amygdala first and foremost, then the hippocampus, right, the visual thalamus, all these deep limbic structures. The other processing system involves conscious processing in the cortex. So we kind of laid out with this idea that, yeah, maybe there are conscious and non-conscious emotions. So we can have conscious processing in the cortex, especially, you know, the prefrontal cortex. But then what about the non-conscious structures? Also, this is where we begin to also determine our relationship to different species, and to the extent, to what extent do we have a rich kind of emotional existence versus a relatively impoverished emotional existence, maybe in some animals that are further back on the evolutionary timeline. So the biological mechanisms that work behind our emotions include the limbic system, which is for quick automatic responding. For example, this is something that causes us to respond quickly, often outside of awareness. That is, our response precedes our conscious processing of the stimulus that's causing us to respond. The reticular formation is brain level sympathetic nervous system responding for negative emotions, right? And also just monitoring the environment in general. We had the example of the cat earlier in the course, where we saw the cat was alerted by its reticular formation to kind of wake up, because it's processing non-consciously, to wake up and pay conscious attention to the potential stimulus. So the cerebral cortex is where the conscious processing experience in higher level emotion processing. And the highest, kind of the pinnacle of this structure then in the prefrontal cortex is our ability to actually not only experience emotions, but to inhibit responses to emotions. And it's that inhibitory process which is probably the highest level process. We had those discussions about free will early in the class. Ralph Baumeister wrote an article, and he suggested that the evidence of free will is our ability to inhibit responses, which is an interesting kind of idea, that if we're able to choose to not act on a response pattern, then that might represent i.e. choice, and be one of the best kinds of evidence for the possession of free will. But again, take that for what you want. The discussion of free will is often one that leads us down a long, winding path to no resolution. So I want to show you a quick example here of how these two systems then are integrated. It's a very simple example. We have a brain, and that's what it looks like. Yeah, it's a brain. And we put the eyes out front, right? And the eyes, oh, there's our stimulus. So we need some kind of stimulus, and in this case it's a snake. And many people, how many of you are afraid of snakes? A lot of you are afraid of snakes. Some people posit that fear of snakes, fear of spiders is an automatic, it's almost an evolutionary legacy. That's another issue. But what we know is that the light will reflect, the electromagnetic energy reflects off the snake, and then that electromagnetic energy is received by the eyes, and on the retina, the electromagnetic energy is transduced by the rods and cones to neural impulses. So those neural impulses are sent along the optic nerve, so there we go along the optic nerve, to this non-conscious mechanism in the limbic system called the visual thalamus. Now what does the visual thalamus do? Well, it immediately processes the signal and probably integrates information from the hippocampus and the amygdala. But the amygdala is kind of the star of our brain in this particular example. The amygdala then immediately sends information through the motor cortex, right? So I see a snake, bam, I jump. And I respond, right, or I recoil even before I'm consciously aware of that process. This system is very fast, and this system is a lifesaver. This is part of our evolutionary legacy that allows us to react super fast, split-second times, right, to threat and keep us safe. Now, what else happens with the image that's been transduced in these neural impulses? Well, they're going through the visual thalamus, and they will eventually, and I mean eventually, get back to the visual cortex for conscious processing. And then the conscious processing takes place, which is a far more thorough and elaborate level of processing, and likely a far more accurate system of processing. So that then sends information back to the amygdala for refining the behavioral response, or in this case, since we're talking emotion this lecture, the emotions that we experience. So I see a snake, right? Boom, visual thalamus, fear, jump, boom, that fast, right? Now, this part says, oh, let's study the image of the snake a little more closely. Oh, what was yesterday, anyone? How would we know in this context? Yesterday was April 1st. April Fool's, it was a rubber snake. And that's, oh shit, now I don't need to be afraid. I might be embarrassed for responding, that is, have another emotional experience. We're blessed with this two-road system. Some people call this the high road, right? Other people call this the low road. No, I got that backwards. The low road and the high road. Forgive me for that. But what we need to know is one is quick, but maybe sacrifices accuracy for speed. The other, far more accurate, but it's slower. So it's a trade-off of these two systems. The bitchin' thing is, as a species, we have both systems that operate in an integrated fashion. Okay? Questions about that? All right. So, basic emotions then are often thought to be emotions that come to us through some aspect of our evolutionary legacy. But what we find with emotion researchers is there's rarely any agreement on what constitutes basic emotions. So you don't need to memorize this chart, right? What this chart tells us is we look at these major emotion researchers who've developed a huge reputation over the years. Guys like Plutchik, Arnold, Ekman and his group, Frieda, Gray, Itzhar, James, Panskip, Tompkins. Remember we talked about William James way back in the beginning of the class, and he was talking about instincts, but John Watson was talking about learning. We know from little baby Albert. What do we know about these guys? Well, when they build their theory of emotion, and each of them built a theory of emotion, they said there are basic emotions. And they identified the basic emotions. The question is, how are you deciding that's a basic emotion or not? What is your criteria? Right? And that's where we get to the basis for inclusion on the list as a basic emotion. And that's where we see interesting differences between the folks that propose these basic emotions. We look at James. Let's pick on William James first. He says basic emotions: fear, grief, love, rage. You say, okay, so William James, how did you come to this idea? How do you call those basic emotions? And he says, well, because they're freaking hardwired. Right? That is, they're wired right into the brain. Right? I'm sorry, not hardwired. They represent bodily involvement. So for William James, and remember the example we used, I see a bear, I run, and then I realize I'm afraid. Where did the emotion come from? Running from a stimulus object. The explanation for that running then becomes, oh, I was afraid. Right? So fear. Right? Others take a different approach. For example, Gray, rage and terror, anxiety, joy, hardwired, as we suggested. And notice that different emotion researchers kind of fall into different camps, or emotion cults, if you will. They're not cults, but I don't know. Let's take Frida. This is desire, happiness, interest, surprise, wonder, sorrow. These are forms of action readiness. That is, emotions are preparing us to behave, to commit to actions in a certain respect. The one I want to talk about right now, though, is the Ekman group, who have anger, disgust, fear, joy, sadness, surprise. They're going to add on, that's 6, I'm going to add on a 7th a little later, right? And these are derived from universal facial expressions, so it has a biological basis. So Paul Ekman, here we go, and you can go to the Emotional Intelligence Academy if you so wish. That would be a live link on your lecture that could take you there. But let's talk about Ekman. And let's play a little game here. So it's up to you to identify the emotion. We're going to start here in the upper right. So what emotion is she exhibiting? Give you a second. Next, what about middle upper? What do you think? What do you think that emotional expression is? How about all the way over to the upper left? This young man here down in the lower right. And then the woman here in the middle bottom, and then finally our gentleman in the lower left. And the idea is, what Ekman does is he takes pictures like these, and then he traveled across the globe. 21 different countries, right? All kinds of different cultures. And he would show people these pictures and say, can you identify this emotion? And people would say, yeah, that's such and such. Yeah, that's such and such. Well, when he got sufficient agreement, 90+ agreement within a culture on that emotional demonstration, he listed it as a basic emotion because people, regardless of culture, could reliably identify these at that rate, right? So that's how he decided to call them basic emotions, because it seems like our face is, in fact, structured to demonstrate these emotions, and they can be recognized regardless of culture and basically regardless of learning in that regard. So Ekman ran around and he showed all these. Do we know what they were? Let's just go back. She was happy, surprised, afraid, angry, disgusted, and sad. So we can see. Now, Ekman shared these around conferences. He wrote papers on these, and a couple people come, at the end of a talk or a conference to say, hey, what do you think about, hey, what do you think about? And someone asked the question, hey, what do you think about? And they offered, so this was a 7th basic emotion that was incorporated later after the original 6. Let's see if you can get that one. I want you to imagine, let's say I'm in a bar, and I see this woman across the bar, and I walk over to her and I say, hey, how are you? Can I buy you a drink? What do you think? How am I doing? Yeah, probably not so good. This more recent 7th basic emotion, Ekman labeled as contempt, right? Now, how do we get at this? Well, Ekman is really relying on the facial musculature. And notice, this is where Darwin was going way back in the day. So we have the facial action coding system that was developed by Ekman's laboratory, Right? And you as an undergraduate research assistant or a graduate student learn the facial action coding system. That is, you actually learn about all the various musculatures and changes in the musculature with given changes, then that represents the emotional display, which then is telling us what the underlying emotion was that caused that display. So the facial action coding system allows us to then quantify movements in the face and thus quantify emotions based on the facial display. So certainly huge empirical support for this, a great piece of work, if you will. All right. Now in the next part, which I'm gonna shut this off and go to the next part, we're gonna talk about a more modern application of this, and we're gonna play Go Bucks for a while because we're gonna land our feet at Ohio State research. So let's get that done.